On December 5th, 1952, a thick fog started settling over London. It wasn't that unusual at all, as London had seen many fogs before this, and most people thought it was just another pea soup, a mix of fog and smoke so common it even had a name. But this time, it didn't clear. Not the next morning, not the one after that, not for days. By the third day, visibility dropped so low that people couldn't see their own feet. Trains stopped running, ambulances were pulled off the roads, even inside homes and buildings the air turned yellow. Movie theaters had to shut down because the smog crept in and blurred the screens. At the time, people assumed it was just another bad fog. Certainly annoying, but not deadly. They didn't know it yet, but the air they were breathing was toxic, and it was silently killing thousands. Most of the deaths happened slowly. There were no big public warnings from the authority, no coordinated response at all. But hospitals started filling up, and it would take weeks for the government to finally admit how serious it had been, and years before the full death toll came out. The final estimate was around 12,000 deaths, most of them from respiratory failure or infections made worse by the smog. Yet despite its toll, almost no one was held responsible. The government downplayed the crisis for years, and industry kept burning coal unchecked until mounting public fury finally forced them to change the laws. This is the story of the Great Smog of London. To understand what happened in December 1952, we have to look at what London was burning and how the air was behaving. Most households at the time heated their homes with coal, especially the cheaper low-grade version called nutty slack. It was dense, dirty, and full of sulfur. It released large amounts of smoke, sulfur dioxide, and other particles when burned. And in the weeks leading up to the smog, a cold snap hit southern England. Temperatures dropped, and demand for heating surged. That meant more coal being burned in homes, in power stations, in factories, all across the city. Normally, all that pollution would rise and slowly disperse into the atmosphere, but on the night of December 4th, a high-pressure system moved in and created what's called a temperature inversion. Basically, a layer of warm air settled on top of the cold air near the ground. That trapped the pollution close to the surface, like a lid holding it in. There was no wind, no sunlight, no movement, so everything just stayed there. And it built up fast. By the morning of the 5th, the fog was already mixing with coal smoke and vehicle exhaust. By the 6th, it started reacting with the sulfur dioxide in the air, forming sulfuric acid particles, extremely dangerous to breathe in. These were microscopic, but they got deep into people's lungs. They inflamed the airways, triggered asthma, and worsened chronic conditions like bronchitis and heart disease. The visibility problems weren't just fog-related. A lot of it was from the particulate matter such as soot, ash, or tar that were suspended in the air. It got into homes, schools, and hospitals. Even filtered masks weren't much help because the particles were so fine. And London didn't have air quality monitoring back then, and people were walking blind into a public health crisis. It actually wasn't the first time something like this had happened. There had been warning signs. Smaller smogs in 1948 and 1949 had already caused spikes in hospital visits and deaths. Scientists and public health officials had raised concerns, but there were no regulations in place to reduce coal use or limit industrial emissions. The government didn't treat it as urgent, so by the time the Great Smog hit, the city was completely unprepared. The weather made it worse, but the real cause was human. A perfect storm of poor quality fuel, outdated infrastructure, and political inaction. In the first day or two, most Londoners treated the smog like a nuisance. It wasn't uncommon for the city to be blanketed in pea soupers, the nickname of this thick, dirty fog that made things hard to see, but usually cleared up in a few hours or days. So people tried to go about their business. But the smog didn't lift. It got worse. By the third day, visibility dropped to just a few feet in some areas. Cars were abandoned in the street. Buses couldn't run without people walking ahead of them, guiding drivers by hand. Underground stations were also crowded with people trying to avoid walking through the streets. At hospitals, staff wore masks indoors because the smog was seeping in through windows and vents. Emergency services were overwhelmed. Ambulances couldn't reach patients in time, and that if they came at all. People started showing up at hospitals with severe breathing problems, many of them elderly or already ill. In some wards, patients were being treated in beds pushed up against windows blackened with soot. But yet, there was no official declaration of an emergency, no coordinated public response. The British government didn't issue widespread warnings or guidance. The Ministry of Health later claimed they didn't realize how serious it was until days after the smog had already cleared. Part of that was a lack of data. The city didn't have real-time air monitoring systems at the time. Hospitals also didn't immediately report the scale of the crisis. And there wasn't yet a culture of fast response public health infrastructure, the way we'd expect today. But part of it was also political. Coal was essential to the British economy. It powered homes, fueled industries, and employed hundreds of thousands of workers. Calling attention to a coal-driven public health disaster would have raised questions the government didn't want to answer, especially in the middle of winter, when people still needed coal to heat their homes. So the authorities stayed quiet, and people just tried to cope. They wore scarves and masks, they carried flashlights during the day, they stayed indoors when they could, but the air kept getting worse. By the time the fog finally lifted on December 9th after a shift in the weather broke the inversion, thousands of people were already dead, many more were in hospitals, and thousands more would die in the weeks that followed. Most people didn't realize just how bad it had been until long after it was over. The official number most commonly cited today is around 12,000 dead, but at the time, the British government only acknowledged about a quarter of that. In the weeks after the smog cleared, the Ministry of Health released early estimates suggesting around 4,000 excess deaths. That figure was based on a sharp and immediate spike in mortality data starting December 5th, and peaking just as the fog lifted. But even that number was downplayed. Officials framed the deaths as inevitable, mostly among the old and the sick. It was treated as a kind of statistical blip, not a disaster. And that framing didn't hold up. Over the next few months, researchers began noticing that mortality remained unusually high. The people who didn't die during the fog itself were still dying in large numbers afterward, mostly from respiratory infections, pneumonia, and complications related to asthma and bronchitis. By the time long-term studies were completed, especially those published by public health researchers in the decades that followed, the revised death toll had more than doubled. The most cited analysis came from epidemiologist Dr. William Logan and others who reviewed mortality records across London boroughs. They looked at total deaths from December through March, compared them to previous years, and adjusted for population growth and seasonal flu variations. Their findings were clear. The 5-day smog event triggered a cascading public health crisis that extended well beyond that initial week. About 60% of the deaths occurred in people over 65, most of whom had pre-existing lung or heart conditions. But the smog also affected young children, especially those with asthma. Hospitals reported spikes in pediatric admissions for wheezing and lung infections. Even healthy people with no underlying conditions experienced shortness of breath, irritated eyes, and difficulty walking more than a few blocks without coughing fits. The government didn't commission a full official inquiry until 1954, 2 years after the fact, and even then, the results were cautious. There was no public reckoning. No one was held personally responsible. The deaths were attributed to a natural accumulation of weather and seasonal illness, though internal documents later revealed that policymakers had known about the air quality risks from coal smoke for years, and because there were no direct fatalities recorded as smog-related on death certificates, many victims were quietly absorbed into the categories of heart failure, bronchitis, or flu. Their deaths weren't invisible, but they weren't acknowledged for what they were either. The truth came out slowly, mostly through scientists, journalists, and community records, and even now, the exact number may never be fully known, but the consensus is clear. Tens of thousands were harmed, and at least 12,000 died. Not from war, not from disease, but from the air they breathed. May the souls of all the victims rest in peace.